I'm Rosemary Pell, and you're watching Hearth Home, a small study in homemaking, thrift, and care. We explore the gentle, useful skills that make everyday living smoother. If it speaks to you, do subscribe or share so it can find its people.
There's a passage in an old homemaking manual from 1952 that I've read so many times the page has gone soft at the crease. It says that Sunday supper is the meal where time does most of the cooking. I didn't understand that for the longest while. Thought maybe it was just pretty language meant to ease the burden on tired women. But the more I studied the way households used to run, the more I realized it wasn't poetry at all. It was instruction. Sunday supper wasn't about what you put on the table. It was about when you put it there, and how you let the hours in between do their quiet work. Sunday had a different clock than the rest of the week. It moved in pauses and pockets, in the slow stretch between morning service and afternoon callers, between the last hymn and the first hello at the screen door. The women who cooked Sunday supper weren't working against time the way they did Monday through Saturday. They were working with it, letting it settle into the roast, letting it thicken the gravy, letting it turn yesterday's cream into today's butter, while they changed out of their good shoes. The meal itself was almost secondary to the choreography of the day. You started early, you paused often, and you trusted that flavor deepens when you're not watching it. I've spent a fair amount of time with old church bulletins and community cookbooks, the kind that get passed around at potlucks and tucked into recipe boxes with grease-stained corners. What struck me wasn't the recipes themselves. It was the notes in the margins. Things like, start this before you leave, or can hold until 3, or good cold on Monday. They were cooking in pencil, marking time the way you'd mark a calendar, and the food was just the evidence of how well they'd planned the day. Take a roast chicken with buttered rice, green beans, and lemon icebox pie. There's nothing simpler and nothing more forgiving. You season the chicken the night before if you're organized, or the morning of if you're not. You set it in the oven while you're buttoning your collar, and then you leave it. The house fills with the smell of it while you're gone, and when you come back, it's done its work without any fussing. The rice waits in a warm pot without complaint. The beans take hardly any effort and reheat with grace. The pie's been waiting since Saturday, getting colder and firmer and better with every hour. You're not racing the clock. You're letting the clock carry the load. The genius of Sunday cooking is that it accounted for interruption. Someone might drop by after church. Your sister might bring her children. The preacher might stay for coffee and end up staying for supper. So the women who cooked well on Sunday didn't cook tight menus. They cooked loose ones. Pot roast is like that. It benefits from sitting, from slow time, from being made early and left to think about itself and its own juices. You can serve it at 2 or at 4, and it won't punish you for the delay. Mashed potatoes can be made in the morning and brought back to life with a little milk and butter just before serving. Sliced tomatoes require nothing but a knife and a little salt. And yeast rolls, if you've kept a batch of dough cold and ready, can be shaped and baked whenever the house starts to settle. This is a meal designed for visitation, for letting the afternoon unfold however it wants to unfold. I think about the women who developed these rhythms, how much they understood about the physics of a household. They had to cook in a way that bent with the day instead of against it. That meant thinking 3 moves ahead. If you baked a ham on Sunday, you weren't just feeding that day. You were setting up Monday's sandwiches, Tuesday's beans cooked with the bone, maybe even Wednesday's soup if you were thrifty enough to save the broth. Macaroni and cheese in a casserole dish meant it could sit, hold, be reheated, travel to a neighbor's house if someone took ill. Collards simmered on their own timetable. And deviled eggs were insurance, the kind of food that said, in case someone comes by, in case there are more mouths than expected, we are ready. There's something almost mathematical about the way those menus worked. Every Sunday meal I've studied had at least one element that improved with time, one that could be prepared in advance, one that required almost no attention, and one that signaled abundance, even when there wasn't much money to spare. Chicken and noodle soup, for instance, is about as forgiving as food gets. You can make it before church or after, and it will wait for you either way. Biscuits take hardly any ingredients, but feel like celebration. Fruit salad reads as dessert without committing you to an hour at the oven. It's a light meal, a simple meal, but it accommodates a house full of people who might not all sit down at the same time. Sunday supper in the South often had a kind of syncopation to it. There were the long, slow-cooked elements that hummed along in the background. And then there were the quick, last-minute tuckas that brought everything to life right before serving. Shrimp and grits is a perfect example. Grits keep warm almost indefinitely if you treat them right. The greens can simmer for an hour or 3, doesn't matter much. But the shrimp cook at the very last minute, just a few minutes in a hot pan. And that's when the whole meal wakes up. You time it like a waltz, everything moving at its own pace, until it all comes together in the final turn. And then there's pound cake, which might be the ultimate Sunday dessert. You bake it today, and it's good all week. It doesn't need frosting or fuss. It just sits there on the counter under a glass dome, ready whenever someone needs a slice. What we've lost, in the rushing and the microwaving and the delivery apps, is the idea that cooking can be restful if you let it happen in layers instead of all at once. Sunday supper wasn't a race, it was an arrangement. You started something in the morning that didn't need you for a while. You folded laundry or sat on the porch with a glass of tea while the oven did its work. You came back to the kitchen when it called for you, not before. And because you weren't standing over every pot, the food had room to become itself. A roast that sits for 20 minutes after it comes out of the oven is a different thing than a roast carved the second the timer goes off. Time is an ingredient, maybe the most important one. And Sunday cooking understood that. The women I read about in those old domestic manuals weren't famous cooks or trained chefs. Most of them were just trying to hold a household together on not much money and even less free time. But they developed systems that were elegant in their efficiency. They knew that if you cooked enough on Sunday, you could ease the burden on Monday. They knew that food which traveled well could be sent to a sick neighbor without much fuss. They knew that a meal served at 3 in the afternoon needed to be different from a meal served at 6 in the evening. They were students of tempo, and Sunday supper was their dissertation. I wonder sometimes if we've mistaken convenience for ease. We can have dinner on the table in 15 minutes now, but 15-minute meals don't teach you much about patience, or the satisfaction of starting something in the morning that rewards you in the evening. They don't leave room for the bread to rise, or the flavors to marry, or the house to fill with the smell of something worth waiting for. Sunday supper, at its best, was a lesson in delayed gratification. If I were planning a Sunday supper today, knowing what I know from all those old manuals and recipe cards and penciled notes, I'd think first about the shape of the day. What time does the house wake up? When will people be hungry? Who might stop by? I'd choose at least one thing that gets better with sitting, something I can start and then forget about for a while. I choose sides that don't demand much attention, that can hold their heat or be served at room temperature without suffering. And I'd choose a dessert that's already made, that's been waiting patiently in the icebox or under a cake dome. One thing slow, one thing easy, one thing made ahead. Everything else is just variation. The beauty of Sunday cooking is that it teaches you to trust the process. You put the chicken in the oven and you walk away. You stir the grits and then you let them set. You slice the tomatoes and you don't fuss over them. Every step is an act of faith that the food will do what it's meant to do without you hovering. And 9 times out of 10, it does. That's what the old cookbooks were really teaching, I think. Not recipes, but confidence. The confidence to start something and step back. The confidence to let time be your partner instead of your enemy. Sunday supper was never trying to impress anyone. And maybe that's why it impressed everyone. It wasn't about showing off or proving anything. It was about feeding people well with what you had, stretching it as far as it needed to go, and making sure there was enough warmth at the table that no one left hungry. The food mattered, of course it did, but the timing mattered more. That's what made it Sunday. That's what made it sacred. Not the recipes, but the rhythm. Not the menu, but the mercy of a meal that waited for you, that bent with you, that forgave you when the day ran long or the guests arrived late. Sunday supper was patient, and in being patient, it taught patience. And I think we could all use a little more of that. A little more sitting with things. A little more letting time do the work. A little more trust that if we start early and pause often and serve when the house settles, everything will turn out just fine.
Brought to you by Inception Point AI. Subscribe, like, and comment for more.